This playlist collects and organizes the segments of the first lecture on utilitarianism, which covers roughly the same material covered in the first reading from Rachel on utilitarianism. I'll have a slightly different emphasis. I'll spend a little more time on the history, on some of the particularities of the figures, and then talk about the general doctrine. So we'll start with a brief history of the period from 1760 to 1870. The 1800s were really the emergent and most significant theoretical period for utilitarianism. So we'll talk about events that led up to these times and events that occurred during these times. And we'll look equally briefly at the history of utilitarianism by focusing on the major figures of the 1800s. We'll start with the first utilitarian theorist, Jeremy Bentham. Then we'll skip historical order and talk about the last theorist, Henry Sedgwick. And we'll turn to perhaps the most theoretically influential and iconic figure, John Stuart Mill. We'll talk about Mill's famous articulation and defense of the doctrine of utilitarianism in his book called Utilitarianism. And we'll talk about the structure of the book and how it purports not only to justify the utilitarian principle, but to explain how notions of the morality of individual acts, of duties, and of social justice all have their foundation in this principle. And finally, we'll look at the specific assertions of classic utilitarianism as articulated by Mill in that book. So the high point, theoretically, of utilitarianism was during the 1800s. It's when the doctrine first emerged and when its greatest theoreticians thrived. During that time, utilitarians crafted one of the most influential and widely accepted versions of consequentialism in ethics. And this period is marked by the works of three classic proponents of that doctrine. Jeremy Bentham, whose most famous work was published in 1789, John Stuart Mill, who published Utilitarianism in 1861, and Henry Sedgwick, who published his most famous work in 1874. So what's consequentialism anyway? Well, consequentialism just refers to a family of ethical views that all link an action or a rule's ethical standing to its real-world outcomes. So what the action results in, how the rule shapes things, that's what determines its ethical standing. Its consequences are the key to understanding its ethical or moral goodness or badness. Utilitarianism, as the name suggests, is a consequentialist theory that determines the ethical standing of an action or a rule based upon the amount of good that results from that action or rule, specifically good being understood as some or other conception of happiness. So here's Jeremy Bentham. He lived from 1748 to 1832, and he was the first modern advocate of utilitarianism. He was also an influential political reformer. He was a child prodigy who was born into a wealthy Tory family in 1748. When he became an adult, his secretary, John Mill, who was John Stuart Mill's father, was his close associate and theoretical correspondent. And together they were primarily responsible for John Stuart Mill's education. In John Stuart Mill, his father and Bentham hoped to create a new generation of utilitarian scholars that would carry on their revisionist vision. Now, Bentham's a sort of interesting character, both because he really did think that we could just calculate out the hedonic value of all of our actions, but also for other sort of eccentricities. So this is called the auto icon, the picture I've just brought up, and it's a cabinet that's on display at University College London. And at the bottom here, you can see Bentham's actual preserved head, and then a likeness of him mounted on top of stuffed clothes of his is in display in the auto icon. And so people can come and see Bentham's actual head and then this mannequin characterization of him like a wax dummy, essentially. So let's look at the historical period and the events that helped to shape the doctrine of utilitarianism. So a number of events, both during the period beginning about 1760 and running to approximately 1870, helped shape the new conception of ethics that we now recognize as utilitarianism. For instance, the North American and French revolutions helped to create the modern nation state, with its emphasis on participatory democracy, individual rights, and rule of law. In fact, historians will often cite the Stamp Act of 1765 as the beginning of a cascade of events that ultimately led to the American Revolutionary War in 1775. The American Revolutionary War lasted until it was officially ended by the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The United States Constitution was ratified by the states in 1788, and the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights, was ratified in 1791. This is the oldest active constitution of a country, and it does articulate this democratic notion based on individual rights and rule of law. In France, fiscal difficulties from their 7 Years' War, as well as their contributions both financially and militarily to the American Revolution, ultimately bring about the events of 1789 that triggered the First French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution lasted from 1789 until about 1799, when Napoleon seized power in France. Napoleon held power for a great deal of the time between 1799 and 1848. But in 1848, multiple revolutions and uprisings erupted all across Europe, including what's commonly called the Second French Revolution that led to the Second French Republic. In 1861, we see hostilities begin in the U.S. Civil War, which continued until 1865. And many of the wars, revolutions, uprisings, and social reforms during this period were driven by the desire for a more inclusive society, having greater equality, both of rights and of wealth. And this gave rise, in part, to utilitarianism as a doctrine. Now, in England, we see a different kind of revolution beginning to take shape. The Industrial Revolution radically changed manufacturing, beginning about 1760 and running until about sometime in the 1840s. Now, the effects, both the negative and the positive effects of the Industrial Revolution in England, produced calls for great social reform. So, for instance, Dickens first published Oliver Twist as a serial from 1837 to 1839. Now, these calls for social reform brought about reforms not only to things like child labor laws and poor laws, but it also empowered a newly rich middle class. And Bentham's utilitarian ideals appealed to the middle class for a couple of reasons. In part, it appealed to them because it seemed to sanction the pursuit of their own happiness, and because it suggested a more democratic ideal of government, which was more inclusive and gave them more rights.